Less than 2 years ago, the Atlanta Hawks were 2 games away from the NBA Finals, despite a midseason coaching change and one of the worst defenses in the league. Now, granted, we all kind of knew that they weren't really a conference finals level team and more so took advantage of a dysfunctional Sixers team in the second round, but it was still an impressive accomplishment for such a young roster. And unlike some of the recent fraudulent conference finals teams that we've seen, like the 2022 Mavs or the 2019 Blazers, the Hawks had a ton of room to grow, including, of course, superstar guard Trae Young. Fast forward to now, a few coaches, 2 average seasons, and a major roster shakeup later, and the Hawks are basically an irrelevant postseason team once again. What is very relevant, however, is the trade rumors swirling around Young himself. In the past, we've seen the typical "I'm a star and I'm mad about how bad my team is" rumors with Young, even earlier than we've seen from most other stars. But what's different about this situation is it looks like the team itself wants to move on from Young as well. And we haven't ever really seen that before. Yes, technically the Jazz chose to get a head start on a rebuild last offseason by dumping Donovan Mitchell, maybe earlier than some people would have thought, and he didn't specifically request a trade at the time, but there was pretty massive personnel turnover in the front office and the coaching staff that made it pretty clear that a rebuild was in the cards. At that point, the Jazz had also proven that they had a clear ceiling on their team and they were on the clock with Mitchell anyway. The Hawks, on the other hand, seem to be more open to the idea of trading away a young star than pretty much any team we've seen recently. A lot of times we see star trade rumors like this, and it is other teams monitoring the situation. This player might be unhappy. But this time around, we're seeing rumors about the Atlanta Hawks front office potentially actively looking for trade partners to trade away Trae Young, whether he requests a trade or not. And I think if we're being honest, even the biggest Trae Young fans out there that are watching this video can understand why that might be the case. As great as he is as an offensive player, there's certainly flaws to his game. Defensively being the first thing, if you're going to be a team acquiring Trae Young or building around Trae Young, you have to have an incredible amount of defense around him just to have a league average team defensively. It's not all effort, although his effort is simply really, really bad most of the time. It just comes down to the fact that he is a smaller guy. He's skinnier, and it's going to be really difficult for him to defend NBA level athletes. We've seen guys like Steph Curry that are similar size and similar height put in a lot of effort and be pretty quality, at least league average defenders at the NBA level. But that's not something that we've seen out of Trae Young, and his limitations on the defensive end are something that I think certainly has frustrated Atlanta as well as their fans. And if he does go to a new team, you're going to have to think around that as well. Now, this next part is probably a little bit unfair, but it has to be talked about anyway. Is Trae Young a player that drives coaches away? Because it was pretty clear by the time that they got rid of him that Trae Young wasn't a huge fan of Lloyd Pierce, and then Nate McMillan just seemed very tired by the time his Atlanta Hawks tenure came to an end. And I'm not blaming all of that on Young, but I do think it's worth mentioning. But I also think that speaks more so to the general vibes around Trae Young to this point in his NBA career, that maybe he's not the best teammate. Maybe he's not the most fun guy ever to play with, and the way that he plays, typically, you have to focus pretty much everything that you do, especially offensively, around what Trae Young does to maximize his talents, and that's not always super fun for the other 4 guys on the floor that are just standing in the corner and shooting threes. Now, yes, there is a lot of negative to Trae Young, which is why the team might potentially be actively exploring trades for him, but is there a market for him? Absolutely. Is it complicated? Yes. But there is a market for Trae Young. There's going to be a ton of teams that are going to be very interested in trading for him if Atlanta chooses to do so. Now, what makes it complicated for other teams are all the things that I mentioned in the previous section. Defense, issues with coaches, potential just bad vibes. But what makes it complicated for Atlanta is their own recent roster decisions. Because I mentioned that conference finals team in the intro 2 years ago, and this team looks dramatically different to that one. We have no Kevin Huerter. DeJounte Murray, of course, is involved here, and the Murray trade specifically really makes the Trae Young situation complicated because the thought process behind bringing in Murray in the first place was twofold. One, bringing in a defensive guard that can play alongside him, that can cover up a lot of the defensive issues that you have when you have Trae Young out there for 35 minutes a game. They weren't thinking that DeJounte Murray was going to be their Klay Thompson in terms of a great fit alongside this guy that shoots the ball and is skinny, someone like Steph Curry. But the thought process was he's a very good defensive guard. We can hide Trae Young a little bit better. And they wanted to be less predictable offensively, especially late in games. And having another creator and playmaker on the level DeJounte Murray was supposed to elevate not only Murray's game from what we saw in San Antonio, but Young's game as well. And in doing so, they traded away multiple assets, including a ton of future first-round picks. For a player, DeJounte Murray, that currently has no long-term commitment to the Atlanta Hawks. And so if you start trading away someone like Trae Young, and then the team is really bad, and DeJounte Murray's looking around wondering, what am I doing here in Atlanta? And he doesn't re-sign, you're looking at a situation where you might have completely ruined the future of your franchise because of these future picks that you owe, in addition to your team just being bad in the moment. Now, of course, that all depends on what they get in exchange for Trae Young, which we now need to talk about. Destinations. What are the teams that could possibly be looking into acquiring Trae Young? So first thought, you got to go through all the big market teams, right? First and foremost, the New York Knicks. And at first I was like, oh, this is easy. You do the RJ Barrett, you do the picks thing. All of a sudden, Trae Young is a New York Knick. They have Jalen Brunson. And am I crazy for thinking that the Knicks might just be okay not doing the Trae Young thing? Like, we have Jalen Brunson. He's like borderline all-NBA caliber player. He's solid. He's steady. Sets everybody else up. And certainly isn't a fit alongside Trae Young. You can't have two guards that small playing all the time. Maybe they're just good without the Trae Young, situation, everything he brings. Obviously, you want to have stars and superstars in New York, and it's still something that they're going to look into, but it's definitely not the cleanest fit, not the way it would have been last offseason when they were actively looking at bringing in someone like Donovan Mitchell. My next thought would be a team like Miami, but I certainly don't think Trae Young is a Heat culture kind of guy. I don't think he's their kind of player that they would look at bringing in or acquiring, not to mention the way the assets would work there would pretty much gut Miami's team. Brooklyn, they've got some future picks. They've got a need in terms of a lead ball handler, but I think they're good on kind of whiny, I want to be traded stars. I think they're good on that for a little bit. Then you get to the Lakers. This is the first legitimately interesting possibility for me. It's weird right now because they have D'Angelo Russell. They're going to have to sign him to an extension this offseason. Figuring out sign and trade mechanics is a really difficult and complicated thing. But if you ignore the sign and trade mechanics for a second, let's say that maybe this happens a year from now, you could do whatever D'Angelo Russell's extension is, plus Austin Reeves and his extension, plus maybe some picks at that point that maybe could interest Atlanta. But even then, I mean, that feels like such a low bar to set Trae Young's trade value at. And after the bigger market teams, you get to some destinations that I think maybe are a little bit more realistic in terms of assets, but maybe that Trae Young would just rather stay in Atlanta rather than go to. The New Orleans Pelicans. They've got plenty of big wings. They've got plenty of guys that they can use to cover Trae Young's issues defensively, and that would be an awesome pairing with him and Brandon Ingram and Zion if he's healthy. They could do a lot of different stuff in terms of assets that they could trade away to Atlanta. They certainly have no shortage of assets. That, to me, as was the case with the Kevin Durant trade, potential Kevin Durant trade, is always a possibility when you have all these picks and you have a roster that seemingly fits really well around any kind of superstar you want to bring in. Minnesota was another team that came to mind to pair him alongside Anthony Edwards to try and save this disaster team that they have since the Rudy Gobert trade. But because of the Rudy Gobert trade, I'm not sure that they really have the assets to make a Trae Young trade work either. And then you're looking at teams like Charlotte to play alongside LaMelo. Like maybe Charlotte would give you every single asset they have to try and bring in Trae Young to just try and create an exciting, backcourt duo alongside LaMelo. Like that's kind of the point that you get to pretty quickly here with these Trae Young trade possibilities. And that to me is where I land with all this. It feels really dramatic right now. It feels like a really strange situation because Atlanta seems really eager to move on from him. More eager than we've seen from pretty much any team in recent memory with a young star. Like typically it goes, team tries to build around Star. Star doesn't like the team that they built. Star requests trade. Team doesn't really want to trade Star initially, and then team ends up trading Star. Anyway, we appear to be going out of order here and potentially in reverse and the opposite of what I just described with Atlanta and with Trae Young here. And personally, I love chaos. I hope he requests a trade, as soon as they get knocked out of the play-in tournament. Like I think that would be super, super fun. It would be an incredibly interesting storyline to continue to pay attention to all offseason. But I do also think it's going to create an incredible debate on what the actual value of Trae Young is. And it's coming in an interesting time period in terms of star trades where we saw last offseason some significant overpays with the DeJounte Murray trade, with the Rudy Gobert trade, where teams are going to start maybe reeling it in a little bit in terms of what they're willing to trade away for these superstars and these star trades. And when you add into that the defensive issues, some of the culture issues that Trae Young potentially brings with him, as well as how much you really have to build your entire offense around him, I don't think that Trae Young's trade value is necessarily as high as maybe everyone else would think at the moment. He's not your typical star. He's not someone that you feel like you can just put onto your team and you're going to win 50 games. He's not someone that you feel like you can put out there and he immediately fits with any kind of team. He is a system-specific star player. Offensively, he's a one-man offense completely by himself, but if you'd like to win some basketball games, you need to have the proper infrastructure around Trae Young, and there's not that many teams around the league that, one, would be interested in trading for him, two, has the assets to make it work, and three, after trading away those assets, still has the infrastructure with which to build a solid winning team around Trae Young. And as a result, as of this moment, right now, going into this upcoming offseason, I don't think it's going to happen unless Atlanta gets really, really desperate to move him and are willing to take maybe less than we would initially expect, because they're going to want a lot if they're trading away someone in Trae Young that is still an all-NBA caliber player. And the thing that complicates this more than anything else is owing those future picks to San Antonio and having to constantly guard against still being a decent basketball team when you're trading away Trae Young, as well as making sure that DeJounte Murray either wants to stay or you can get value out of him in a trade as well. It's an incredibly interesting and complicated situation, and I cannot wait to see how Atlanta attempts to remedy it.